Today I'd like to tell you a story about Leigh Leigh, although this story may not be for the faint-hearted. Viewer discretion is advised. Leigh Renee Mears was born in Australia on July 24, 1975 to Robin Lynn Monsell and Robert William Mears. For reasons unknown, Leigh lived with her grandmother between the ages of 4 and 7. At that time, her parents divorced. Leigh's mother Robin remarried and had another daughter, Jessie, in 1983. Around this time, Leigh returned to live with her mother. Her stepfather's last name was Leigh, just like the first name of Robin's daughter, and the girl decided it was a good combination, especially given that Leigh was her sister's last name. Thus, Leigh Mears became Leigh Leigh. She liked this double name and kept it even after her mother left that man. Robin and Leigh were close. When Leigh was 10, her mother took her on an unforgettable trip to Sri Lanka. Upon their return in March 1989, the family moved to Stockton, where Robin met Brad Shearman. They began to live together. Leigh Leigh's family lived on Fullerton Road, Fern Bay, on the northern outskirts of Stockton. Earlier, the family lived near the Stockton Ferry Wharf. It was a pretty secluded place isolated from the town, and that left its mark both on the town itself and on the locals, their manners and pastimes. Stockton had an air of being a distant province. Leigh went to 3 elementary schools successively and finally ended up at Newcastle High School. In 1989, she was in the 8th grade. According to her grandmother, Leigh loved school. The two of them were close. Leigh spent most of her weekends and school vacations at her grandmother's home by Killiban Bay, so the woman knew Leigh pretty well. While there were no issues with school and her grandmother, Leigh's relationship with her parents had a rebellious streak. In such moments, it was clear that she inherited her mother's strong character and her father's determination. According to her aunt, Leigh wanted to become a veterinarian. Leigh was a typical teenager of the late 80s. She listened to popular music, liked loafing about, and occasionally spent time with friends. She made friends easily. A cousin of Leigh's and her best friend Tracy said that they would go off into the movies, rollerblade, or just hang about. There wasn't much to do in town, so teenagers would often just hang about. Virtually the only entertainment was the occasional birthday party of one schoolmate or another. Leigh Leigh was 14 when high schooler Jason Robertson threw a party to celebrate his 16th birthday. The party took place in the North Stockton Surf Club in Newcastle, and Leigh was excited to have received an invitation since she had never been to such grown-up parties. Her parents were slightly concerned with the invitation. Should they let her go? Leigh assured them that there would be adults overseeing the party, and the parents let her go and conditioned that her stepdad would pick her up at 11 p.m., even though the festivities were planned to go on till next morning. The idea was that this would be sort of a test. If she arrives at the pickup spot on time, then she would be allowed to go to other parties in the future. It all sounded quite sensible. On November 3rd, 1989, Leigh went to her first ever teenager party. Most of those invited were students of Newcastle High School, so Leigh didn't worry about not seeing familiar faces. Different sources put the number of people present at 50 to 100, most of them teenagers. That night, Cardinal Sin was playing in the club, which excited Leigh in particular because she had a crush on one of the band members. Most sources write that there were only 2 people of age at the party, the 18-year-old Matthew Webster and the 19-year-old Guy Wilson, who functioned as bouncers and were evidently the people Leigh meant when telling her parents that there would be adults at the party. The party had one important rule: no alcohol or drugs inside the building, so the teenagers went outside to drink beer and bourbon and smoke pot. At 7 p.m., Robin took her daughter to Roberto's Pizzeria, where her friends were waiting for her to then go to the club together. Leigh and her friends met up, walked for about a mile and a half, and arrived at the party around 7:30 p.m. Webster marked those arriving with a green highlighter, and the fun began. At around 8:30 p.m., police arrived. They often patrolled parties to catch people drinking illegally, but the teenagers were warned of the police's arrival in advance and had time to hide either their liquor or themselves. After an inspection, the officers on duty reported to the precinct that everything at the party was normal. In fact, it was at this point that the party stopped being normal. The boys had invited underage girls to the party with the intention of getting them drunk and raping them. They referred to the potential victims as boldies because of their young age. Leigh Leigh was apparently one of the girls invited for this purpose. As soon as she arrived, she was handed a bottle of Jim Beam. She became inebriated rather quickly. This was only to be expected since she was 14 and had probably either never tried alcohol or only imbibed it in small quantities. One version of events said the boys had put cocaine in the bourbon so that the victims would lose control quicker. Cocaine or not, this is what happened to Leigh Leigh. A 15-year-old boy who for legal reasons could not be named and was referred to in official documents as NC1 is quoted to have said the following: "I'm gonna go and f*** Leigh." Shortly thereafter, several people at the party spotted NC1 leading her down to the beach. Witnesses stated that Leigh was so drunk that he had to carry her. When Leigh returned from the beach, she was crying. There was blood on her clothes. Several people tried to console her and find out what had happened. She replied that she was scared that she might be pregnant and that she was bleeding. She told another acquaintance that she hated NC1, and from what she told two other girls who sat her down at one of the tables, it became clear that she had been raped.
"I saw Leigh. I'm not sure where she came from, but she was crying. I could see blood on her pants and between her legs. She grabbed hold of me and said, 'Oh, I'm pregnant!' She was screaming and crying real loud. She fell on the ground. I believe that Leigh was in a lot of pain. Someone said, 'Who done it?' Leigh said, 'He did.'"
The police report stated that some of the boys that she talked to tried to ignore her because they were too young to know what to do with the person in such a condition. At some point during the party, Guy Wilson approached Leigh, placed his arm around her, and asked her for sex. Earlier, several people had heard him saying that since she had already been with one of the boys, then the others could also have a go. "Matt came up to me and said I already had 2 roots. One was with Leigh Leigh, and she's a bit of a slut. Why don't we all just have a go?" So then I pulled my arm around her as she was walking outside and asked her if I could have a root. She said no, and then she walked off and she was on the ground, and I see people around her, so I started pouring beer on her. Leigh pushed him away, at which point Wilson pushed her to the ground and poured his beer on her. He was joined by Webster and about 10 other boys who surrounded her and started yelling abuse, kicking her, spitting, and pouring beer on her. Several people saw this, but nobody came to help.
"Those boys standing around her were spitting beer on her and kicking her. They were kicking her pretty hard, but not as hard as they could have,"
one of the girls later recalled. Nobody reported what was going on or even spoke up to say that this was unacceptable. I walked over to where they were and said, "What's going on here?" He said, "A bit of fun." I poured some beer over her as well. I nearly poured the whole of my twist top over her. I saw them each spit on her about 3 times. I also saw Matt Webster spray her with a mouthful of beer. When I poured the beer over Leigh, I poured it over her left side. She was lying on her side with her knees up towards her stomach. Her head was to the south. When Leigh finally managed to get up, the boys stopped. Staggering, she picked up a bottle and threw it at them but missed. The bottle smashed against the corner of the building. Guy Wilson picked up another bottle and threw it at her, hitting her in the leg. They went after her for a while, and even one of the musicians got off the stage in order to join the hunt. At around 10:30 p.m., Leigh's friends got together to discuss whether to call her parents, in the end deciding against it. Instead, they asked her if they could give her a lift home. Likely not understanding what was going on, Leigh refused and left the club on her own. About 10 minutes later, I saw Leigh Leigh walking across the grass towards the end of the car park. She was about 20 feet away and I called to her, "Leigh, don't go down there." She turned around and yelled at me, "F off and leave me alone." At 11 p.m., Leigh's stepfather arrived on the spot where he had arranged to meet her, but she wasn't there. He went to the club, but all he found there was a bunch of teenagers. He went to search for Leigh on the beach, returned to the club twice, but all to no avail. Finally, he postponed the search till dawn and went home. He and Robin hoped that Leigh had gone off with friends and was maybe sleeping somewhere on the beach, which was something teens often did after a night of partying at the club. In the early morning hours, other locals joined the search, and one of them saw something that looked like a mannequin in the sand. Leigh's body was discovered around 9 a.m. in the sand dunes 90 meters north of the club where the party took place. She was barely recognizable, lying on her back with her legs apart, wearing only her sneakers and pink socks. Some of her clothes were lying around, drenched in beer, turned inside out, as if someone had taken them off her quickly. In the pocket of her shorts was still the invitation to the ill-fated party. A 12-pound rock with traces of blood was found nearby. As always, for those who want all the gruesome details, there will be a link in the description. Leigh's body was sent to the morgue for an autopsy. The post-mortem report stated that she most likely died from a skull fracture from several blunt force blows to the head. There were also multiple injuries on the body, including fingertip pressure marks on her neck and obvious signs of sexual violence. The report did not specify whether she was under the influence of alcohol or drugs. The investigation was led by Sergeant Lance Chaffee, a promising detective who worked with a team of 20 people. As Leigh was found very close to where the party was held, the police decided to interview all the boys present at the party. In total, about 150 people spoke to the police. Many of them had consumed too much alcohol and drugs, befuddling their memories and making their accounts sound more like the plot of some film rather than real events. As for the parents, Chaffee told local reporters that of the 60 families, only 2 parents contacted the police themselves, believing their children might know something. The rest remained silent and expected their offspring to do the same. Sadly, silence would become the leitmotif of this criminal case. The police continued their interrogations. The boy who was codenamed NC1 admitted to having sex with Leigh and another girl of the same age that night, but claimed it was consensual and that she had initiated it. "Did you ask Leigh to go out with you?" "She asked me." "What did she say?" "She said, 'Let's go down to the beach.'" "What happened when you sat down?" "I was just kissing her there. Then she asked me if I wanted to do it." "What did she say?" "Let's do it." "What happened then?" "We did it." Interestingly, the Australian legal system differentiates between the offense of sex with a minor and rape, though the acts are in fact the same. NC1 assured that what happened between him and Leigh should have been considered carnal knowledge, an archaic term for sex with a child under the age of 16, used apparently to avoid calling the offense rape. NC1 said that they both wanted it. He said that Leigh had even wanted it a bit more. This, of course, is utter nonsense. The second boy, Guy Wilson, at first denied the assault. However, later he admitted that he had pushed Leigh and poured beer on her, but insisted he didn't do anything else. He, like NC1, did not have a convincing alibi. Matt Webster also recounted pouring beer on Leigh, but he alleged that afterwards he went to the local pub and met some friends at Roberto's Pizzeria. So he also insisted that he didn't assault Leigh. Several boys had blood tests taken, but since the modern DNA test wasn't yet around, all the investigators could do was compare blood types. But that didn't lead to anything. The 3 main suspects, NC1, Wilson, and Webster, were asked to bring in the clothes they had been wearing that night. Traces of blood were found on the fabric, but none of the samples matched Leigh's blood type. Matthew Webster gave the police a clean set of clothes. He said that he allegedly did not remember what he was wearing that day and just grabbed whatever he found. His underwear was already in the wash at that time, and he said he didn't know which pair he'd worn that day. And apparently, there were no repercussions. The police simply analyzed whatever he brought in. This is how the policeman who came to collect evidence recalled it. "I said, 'What about your shoes and underpants?' Webster then collected an old pair of Dunlop volley shoes from near his wardrobe and handed them to me. He said, "I can't remember which undies I had on. I think they're in the wash anyway." I said, "Were you wearing a jumper or anything like that?" He said, "Yeah, I had a flannel, but it's in the wash too." I said, "Alright, we'll take what we've got." Nevertheless, on November 15th, 1989, Matthew Webster and Guy Wilson were charged with assaulting Leigh. They were released on a $1,000 bail and handed over to their parents. Police hoped that a formal indictment would encourage witnesses to come forth with some important information about that night. But no miracle happened. The town stayed silent. It was as if everyone was conspiring, or rather everyone really was conspiring. Parents forbade their sons to discuss the case or talk to the police, and they themselves pretended that they knew nothing about it. But one Stockton resident, Graham Parsons, decided to break the looming code of silence. He created a poster, made about 50 copies, and plastered the local shopping center with them. It was a dark and gloomy depiction of a dead girl on the sand at the beach, and 3 shadowy figures standing over her, one clutching a big rock. I didn't try to make the 3 people look like anybody in particular. I dressed in the current fashion at the time. T-shirts, flannelette shirts wrapped around the waist, and shorts, long hair, Graham said later. The posters also had the words "Shame Stockton, Shame" printed on them. Evidently, those posters hit the city so hard that already on the next day, somebody removed all of them. About a month after the incident, Matthew Webster was again accused of assaulting Leigh and selling illegal substances to 2 minors at the party. But he was again released on bail, even though he was facing 6 months in jail. Soon after that, Matt had another run-in with the police. On January 28, 1990, a group of 4 boys had a falling out with Webster, accusing him not just of assaulting Leigh, but of murdering her. Matt attacked one of his accusers, and a fight broke out. Matt was eventually fined $250 for aggressive behavior. We don't know why these boys were so confident in their accusation, since none of them spoke to the police afterwards. A similar story happened to Leigh's stepfather, Brad Sherman, soon after Guy Wilson was accused of assaulting Leigh and then released on bail. On January 31st, Sherman got into a fight with Guy, punching him 3 times in the face, allegedly after Guy told Sherman that Leigh's younger sister, who was 6 years old at the time, would be next. Sherman was charged with assault and pleaded guilty. It's not clear what punishment he received. One source claims that he ended up under police surveillance for 12 months. The investigation went on. On February 16, 1990, Matt and Guy were brought to the station for questioning as part of the murder case. At first, they were kept apart from each other. Then they were brought into the same interrogation room and left there. The police expected that they would discuss the crime, deciding, for example, on what they would say to the police. The room was bugged, and the police hoped to record their inadvertent confessions. But that plan didn't work. The young man discussed nothing of the sort. They were then interrogated one by one, and on that evening, Matt Webster suddenly confessed to killing Leigh. But the police didn't even have hard evidence against him. Matthew told the police that he had gone to the beach in search of his beer stash. "Well, I did it, but I just couldn't believe it happened. It's just unbelievable. I went to look for my beers and I saw Leigh sitting down on the grass. My beers weren't there. Somebody must have pinched them. And then I walked up to Leigh and she carried on with her normal shit, and I tried to get onto her. And we walked down to the bushes and I pulled her clothes off and I pulled my shorts down and put my finger in her. I thought I was right for it, and she started pushing me away, saying don't. I lost my temper and I did what I did. She was punching and pushing, and I grabbed her by the throat, and she said don't, and I choked her a bit. She stopped punching, and I grabbed the rock and killed her." Webster, who weighed a hefty 120 kilos, had no trouble pushing Leigh to the ground and undressing her, but she resisted, so he decided to kill her. Webster left her where she died. Despite the fact that he too was under the influence of alcohol and cannabis, Matt managed to wash the blood off his hands with tap water at a nearby marina and headed home. On the way, he stopped to chat with a few mates at Roberto's Pizzeria. Matt told them he'd left the party early and bought a beer at the Stockton Hotel, something he told everyone he met that night, providing himself with an alibi. He returned home at around 11 p.m. Matt claimed that he regrets what happened, not a particularly believable qualm. Case solved, right? The only thing was, Webster's confession didn't match the forensics. Firstly, he said he had grabbed Leigh's throat with his left hand, but the postmortem concluded from the prints that he had used his right hand. Secondly, it was unclear why Matt would go to the marina to wash his hands when the whole thing happened on the beach by the water. It is also unclear how he lifted such a heavy rock with only one hand and managed to hit Leigh with it so accurately. It seems much more likely that somebody was holding her, while somebody else lifted the rock with both hands. Moreover, Matt's clothes were clean, though it remains unclear whether the police got the actual clothes he was wearing that night or completely different set. However, there were red patches on Guy Wilson's clothes, though it was impossible to conclude whose blood it was. The issue of sexualized violence was raised at the trial. The postmortem found no semen in Leigh's body, and the court, including Judge James Wood, did not consider the possibility of a group of boys being involved, despite multiple witnesses saying Leigh was killed by a group of 10 teenagers. Only 3 boys were charged with offenses of varying degrees. When announcing the verdict, the judge emphasized the parents' responsibility for their children's bad behavior. He also said that there were several victims in this story, not only Leigh herself, but the boys who allegedly had their lives ruined by this whole story. He also referred to what happened to Leigh as a sexual act, as if to imply that she was at least partly to blame. Detective Chafee, who led Leigh's case, didn't want it to be considered as a rape case in court, and lied to Leigh's mother about there being a lack of evidence for rape. Here's how the Newcastle Legal Center described it nearly 10 years later. Her state of distress, the fact that she was crying, significantly complaining immediately after. She came back to the clubhouse and told people that she'd been abused, assaulted in that way, and those complaints made by her are clearly indicative of it not being consensual. Her complaints, however, resulted in further assaults upon her, increasing levels of severity, leading to her death. The doctor who examined Leigh's body said that her injuries were consistent with rape performed not with any human appendages, but with an inflexible object, likely a beer bottle. Since Webster pleaded guilty, the trial was held behind closed doors without any witnesses. Instead, a psychiatrist for the defense was called in regard to sentencing, and Detective Sergeant Lance Chafee, who headed the investigation, read to the court a list of the facts. With no other suspects, on October 24, 1990, Matthew Webster was sentenced to 20 years in prison for murder, with the possibility of parole after 14 years. The judge took into account that Matt had no previous convictions. Webster went to Parkley Prison, and what happened to Leigh before her death was of no interest to anyone anymore except for her family. Webster sought to appeal the sentence, which he deemed overly severe. On July 15, 1992, the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed the plea, and we don't know whether Webster appealed again. NC1 was convicted of having sex with a minor and sentenced to 6 months in jail. After an appeal, the punishment was changed to 100 hours of community work. In March 1990, Guy Wilson was sentenced to 6 months in prison for assaulting Leigh, and that was it. Meanwhile, Leigh's mother enlisted the help of criminologist Carrie Carrington to try and get the case reviewed. Carrington, a researcher at the University of Newcastle, spent many years researching Leigh's case and ended up writing a detailed book about it. She believes that the case was being tackled incorrectly starting in the pre-trial phase, when an instance of sexual assault was categorized as consensual intimacy. Nobody paid attention to what happened next, simply throwing out the evidence of Leigh's active non-consent. Carrington's report later laid the groundwork of another lawsuit from Leigh's family. They demanded a larger compensation payout, having lost hope that the court would speak the truth about what happened to their daughter. On May 31st, 1995, Judge Joseph Moore approved the appeal, awarding Leigh's mother and sister an additional $134,000, bringing the total sum of damages to over $150,000. Moore also ruled that Leigh had been sexually assaulted multiple times before death. The case mentioned the names of Jason Robinson, Matthew Webster, Jay Hume, Shane Price, Guy Wilson, and Craig Higginson. Moore pointed out that only one of the assailants had been caught and charged with the crime, a conclusion that makes you think. On July 26, 1995, the Attorney General urged the New South Wales Police Minister to reopen the inquiry in light of Judge Moore's findings, but there was never a reinvestigation. Nearly 10 years later, in 2004, Webster was released on parole. He was arrested again for a parole violation, having allegedly assaulted a man and broken his jaw. However, charges were soon dropped due to insufficient evidence, and in 2005, Matthew Webster, aged 33, walked free for good. He remained under police surveillance until March 29, 2010, and was banned from living in and around Stockton for 6 years. The investigation earned a fair deal of criticism from people outside of Stockton. Many of those who looked into the case years after the murder believed that Webster had not acted alone, and there were indications that the stone had been swung from different directions, suggesting at least one other perpetrator. The police did such a bad job partly because many parents told their children to keep their mouths shut. Leigh's girlfriends were silenced by threats of suffering Leigh's fate. Among the rumors that circulated in town was a story about how the police had been following a teenage drug ring that Leigh knew about and that she was gotten rid of as a witness. There were even rumors that the girl's stepfather was a suspect. This theory suggested that Sherman met Leigh on the beach, grew furious when she told him about what had happened, and picked up the rock which was to become the murder weapon. Even though there wasn't even a shred of evidence to confirm this rumor, the police still suspected Sherman. There were claims that aerial footage showed Sherman searching for Leigh near the shore, keeping away from the place where her body was later found. This could just as well be evidence to the contrary, however. He likely just had no idea where his stepdaughter was. On November 12, 1989, a local paper published a rather curious article. It claimed that the investigators had spoken to 2 girls who had fought off several guys who had tried to kidnap them that ill-fated night. This failed kidnapping, which took place at about 3 a.m., might have had something to do with Leigh's case, the police surmised, but no connection between the 2 cases was found. Leigh's mother, Robin, started a campaign in the hope of drawing more attention to the case and making the public aware of what had happened and how many young people were actually involved. Her calls for a reinvestigation led to a conflict with the police and the Stockton community.
There were very few people that stuck by me. Very few. But I found a lot of people blamed me for moving into the area. If I hadn't moved there, it wouldn't have happened. Those poor boys were being harassed. She got what she deserved. In general, not a very good response whatsoever. I was a bit shocked, actually, because I couldn't really understand what I or my daughter had done to deserve the treatment. And my youngest daughter, I had to pull her out of school because of the abuse she was getting in kindergarten from other students.
Robin left Stockton 3 years after what happened.
Well, after going to the police for a bit of help and being told there was nothing they could do, how can anyone in that situation stay somewhere where they don't feel safe? When I complained to Chaffee that not everyone involved in the assaults and events relating to my daughter's murder had been charged, he said, "Do you know how much it costs to run an investigation?" He said, "Tomorrow we start to lay the first of many charges." They charged Matthew Webster with the murder the following day. Chaffee asked me out to drinks to celebrate. I declined in disgust.
In the late 90s, due to numerous complaints, the case was turned over to the New South Wales Crime Commission and the Police Integrity Commission. The latter's review recommended that Chaffee be fired for gross dereliction and also that measures within the force be taken against 3 officers from Chaffee's team. The review also recommended that the prosecution consider pressing dereliction charges against 5 more law enforcement officers. Alas, these were only recommendations. Around the same time in 1997, the Newcastle Legal Center published its analysis of Leigh's postmortem, concluding that more than one person was involved in the assault, meaning that Webster conspired with his friends and took full responsibility without turning them in. That's when Webster first went to the media insisting that he had acted alone. After that report was published, Detective Chafee resigned, allegedly a little earlier than he had intended, but still claiming that he was proud of the work he and his team had done. In 2000, Robin Leigh and Hilda Armstrong, whose daughter was a childhood friend of Robin's and whose granddaughter was close to Leigh, went to the Newcastle Legal Center to meet with 2 members of the Police Integrity Commission. The women expected to hear that Leigh's case would finally be reopened 10 years later. Instead, the commission members tried to comfort them by laying out 60 Polaroid portraits the police had taken during their initial interviews and beginning to tell them what a cruel joke fate had played on everyone who had attended the party. Hilda Armstrong recounted the following.
They went through the photos one by one and told us what had happened to all of them. How one girl had 3 children now and their father was in jail. How different ones had got into heroin or been in and out of jail. It seemed that none of their lives had come to much. We said, "This isn't what we came to hear. It is not what we wanted to hear that all those children have suffered. We wanted to know what happened to Leigh. But all they could do was show us these photos. It was supposed to make us feel better, I suppose."
Moreover, when reviewing the case, the commission decided instead of solving the true problem of who was involved in the murder, to ask questions about whether the police had infringed upon Matthew Webster's and NC1's rights during the investigation. The commission complained that the police interviewed NC1 without contacting his parents and falsely arrested and assaulted Matt Webster. So once again, the story of Leigh's blood-curdling murder ended up next to the stories of her rapists, whose rights were violated during arrest. For years, Hilda Armstrong had been saying, there was a curse of shame hanging over the town, and it wouldn't be lifted until the truth came out. After all, even the town's media talked about how what happened was likely consensual, and that what really mattered was that Leigh had been drunk. Another popular point was that it was the parents' fault, which was partly fair since there was indeed no adult supervision at the party. A few days after the murder, the Newcastle Herald and the Sydney Morning Herald published front-page articles emphasizing that there were no adults at the party. But given how actively those adults kept their children quiet afterwards, they probably wouldn't have done anything to help Leigh at the time of the attack and might have even taken part in the whole sorry affair. And what's most shocking about the way the case was handled publicly was that Stockton residents actually made Leigh's family responsible for what had happened, saying that it was the poor relationship between Leigh and her mother that led her to end up in that situation. Sure, children from dysfunctional families are statistically more likely to become perpetrators or victims of crime, but it was utterly despicable to shift the focus away from investigating the case and finding the culprits. Whatever condition Leigh was in, whatever family she came from, there is nothing to excuse what had been done to her. There was also a lot of talk about Leigh's alleged promiscuity. Her physical development happened faster than that of her classmates, a fact which unfortunately her mother Robin has also pointed out, and therefore she quickly began to attract interest. And it's not like anyone was teaching their sons not to harass girls. One girl from Stockton, the same age as Leigh, told ABC Radio,
"A lot of people said she was a slut and deserved it. I remember my mom telling me that."
It's understandable why the girl's mother said this. She just couldn't believe something as awful had happened, and tried to justify it by saying that Leigh was somehow wrong and had brought everything on herself. But the truth was, it could easily have been her daughter on that beach, and that was something she wasn't ready to accept. This media coverage of Leigh's murder has become a classic example of victim blaming, and is now studied in Australian universities as a textbook case of a horribly conducted investigation and of people's hysterical desire to whitewash themselves and their children. This, of course, had a negative impact on the community. As you recall, none of the likely accomplices went on to build a normal life. The town saw no punishment for the crimes, and everyone continued to live in fear, trying to hide behind the fantasy that something like that could never happen to them. And all the townspeople who stayed silent do not evoke even a modicum of sympathy nowadays, except of course for Leigh and her family. Leigh's birth father committed suicide in September 1990. It seems likely that rumors of his involvement in his daughter's death played some role in the decision to take his life. Leigh's stepfather spent a week in a psychiatric facility after seeing Leigh's body and being a target of the police who suspected him of the murder. Leigh's story was the inspiration behind the theater play A Property of the Clan, which was later retitled Black Rock and developed into a film of the same name. The play was mostly performed for students, and Leigh's story wasn't the only inspiration. Such parties occurred all over Australia, and Leigh was far from the only victim. With time, Robin Leigh gave up on her quest for the truth, even writing a letter of forgiveness to Matthew Webster, wishing him well for his new life. Hilda Armstrong was clearly vexed by this decision.
I understand her need to let go, but I wonder if she hopes that Webster will finally talk to her and tell her what really happened. I don't believe that will ever happen.
Webster was released in 2004. The building that used to house the ill-fated club was turned into a kindergarten, a move that many locals found rather strange. Some of the parents who now bring their children there remembered the story of Leigh's murder and the talk in the community afterwards. A brother of one of these young mothers was even on the beach on the evening Leigh was murdered. I know we were kinda under suspicion as well. One was my brother. He was young at the time, and the police went to the school and they called him out many times, like interviews, and he felt like really pressured, like he was involved in it, but he wasn't. And even my mom thought it was suspicious. She was really worried about my brothers as well. I think there was always an underlying thing that they knew who it was, but it was really terrible on the community as a whole. Jason Robertson left town, as did many of Leigh's friends. He couldn't cope with the constant reminders that it was at his party that she was murdered. Leigh's gravestone is heart-shaped with a small cross and a praying angel in the corner. In her picture, she's smiling mischievously, an ordinary teenager with a whole life ahead of her. Almost nobody visits her grave except for family and the occasional friend. In the 90s, however, children's stickers would occasionally appear on the gravestone, a sign that there were and still are those who remember Leigh.